World War II was more than a clash of empires, it was a crucible of human courage, cruelty, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Behind every front line and beneath every headline were untold stories of unbelievable daring, relentless resistance, and quiet heroism in the face of impossible odds. In this immersive journey through history, we uncover the most gripping, harrowing, and astonishing true stories from the Second World War. From stealthy sabotage missions and secret codebreakers, to brutal jungle battles and heroic last stands, these are the moments that defined the fate of nations, and the men and women who risked everything. This isn't just history. This is the human spirit on fire. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe if you like this content, and let us know where you're listening from. If you have any suggestions for the next videos, please drop it down in the comments. Thanks for the support. Let's get started. The Ghost Army, Deception with Art. In the dark heart of World War II, amidst the chaotic and brutal battles that swept across Europe, a small, unassuming group of American soldiers waged war in the most unconventional way possible, through the art of deception. This was the Ghost Army, a clandestine unit of artists, designers, and sound engineers whose weapons were not rifles or bombs, but inflatable tanks, powerful loudspeakers, and brilliantly forged false communications. Formed in 1944 under the official title of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army was unlike any other military unit. Made up of over 1,000 men, including talented artists recruited from art schools across the United States, this unit had a singular mission: to mislead, deceive, and confuse the German forces about the true locations and intentions of the Allied armies. Their battlefield was the mind of the enemy. Their most famous operations were carried out in France after the D-Day landings. As the Allies pushed through Europe, the Ghost Army would set up fake divisions. They inflated thousands of rubber tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces, placing them in strategic locations visible to German reconnaissance planes. These rubber vehicles were so realistic from a distance that even trained eyes would be fooled. But visual deception was only part of their trickery. The Ghost Army's engineers set up massive loudspeakers that could broadcast the sounds of marching soldiers, roaring tanks, and the bustling activities of an entire army, all recorded in advance. On moonless nights, the French countryside would echo with the thunderous sound of military might where none existed. Radio deception was another of their powerful tools. Expert radio operators mimicked the communications of actual Allied divisions, creating the illusion of vast armies preparing to strike in areas where only the Ghost Army operated. Their fake transmissions were so convincing that they even deceived German intelligence units monitoring the airwaves. In one of their most dramatic operations, the Ghost Army staged a massive fake army near the Rhine River in March 1945, creating the impression that a large-scale Allied crossing was imminent. As the Germans reinforced this sector, the real Allied forces crossed the river miles away, catching the defenders by surprise and accelerating the collapse of the German front. The courage of the Ghost Army lay not just in their creativity but in the risks they took. Operating in small, isolated groups, they were often close to the front lines and vulnerable to discovery. If captured, they faced the grim possibility of being executed as spies rather than treated as prisoners of war. Their story remained a closely guarded secret for decades, hidden under the shroud of military classification. It was not until the 1990s that the truth about their astonishing wartime role was revealed to the world. Today, the Ghost Army is remembered as one of the most ingenious and effective deception units in the history of warfare. Operation Mincemeat, the man who never was. In 1943, with the war at a critical stage, British intelligence conceived one of the most audacious and successful deception operations of World War II, Operation Mincemeat. It was a plot that would involve a dead body, false documents, and a masterful understanding of human psychology, all to mislead the Axis forces about the Allied invasion of southern Europe. The idea was born in the minds of Ewan Montague, a British naval intelligence officer, and Charles Chumley of MI5. They realized that if they could make the Germans believe the Allies were planning to invade Greece instead of Sicily, it would draw enemy forces away from the true target. But how to convince the Germans? The plan began with the selection of a suitable body, a deceased man who could be transformed into a fictional British officer. Glwandwr Michael, a homeless Welsh man who had died from rat poison ingestion, became the perfect candidate. His body was preserved and dressed in the uniform of Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. Next came the crafting of a convincing false identity. Major Martin was given a backstory, complete with love letters from a fictional fiancée named Pam, theater ticket stubs, a bank overdraft notice, all the small but telling details that would make him seem real. Most crucially, he carried top-secret documents hinting that the Allies would invade Greece and Sardinia, not Sicily. The body, sealed in a container, was transported aboard the British submarine HMS Seraph. On the night of April 30, 1943, the submarine surfaced off the coast of Spain, and Major Martin's body was set adrift. As planned, it washed ashore and was soon discovered by Spanish authorities, who, though officially neutral, were known to have close ties with the German intelligence network. German agents quickly gained access to the documents. Despite a few skeptical voices, the fake papers were taken seriously in Berlin. Hitler himself was convinced, ordering significant reinforcements to be sent to Greece. As a result, when the Allies landed in Sicily in July 1943, they faced far less resistance than expected. Operation Mincemeat was an overwhelming success. It not only saved countless Allied lives but also showcased the extraordinary lengths to which intelligence officers were willing to go to turn the tide of war. The story of "the man who never was" would become a legend, a testament to the power of deception in warfare. The Warsaw Uprising, a city's heroic resistance. In the summer of 1944, as Soviet forces approached Warsaw, the Polish resistance launched a desperate rebellion against the Nazi occupation. This was the Warsaw Uprising, a 63-day struggle fought not by a traditional army but by civilians, students, shopkeepers, and underground fighters of the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa. For years, Warsaw had suffered under the brutal Nazi occupation. Its Jewish population had been decimated in the Holocaust, and its people lived in constant fear of arrest, torture, or execution. But beneath the city's war-torn streets, the resistance was quietly preparing. When Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Warsaw, the resistance saw an opportunity to rise up, hoping to liberate the city before the Red Army's arrival. It was a gamble. One based on faith in Allied support and the promise of Soviet aid. On August 1, 1944, the uprising erupted. Thousands of poorly armed resistance fighters, some wielding little more than pistols, Molotov cocktails, and captured German weapons, surged into the streets. Their courage was matched only by their determination. They seized key buildings, captured German soldiers, and barricaded themselves against counterattacks. Makeshift hospitals sprang up in basements. Civilians became soldiers overnight, and every street became a battlefield. But the Soviets, rather than aiding the uprising, halted their advance on the eastern bank of the Vistula River. Whether due to strategic hesitation or Stalin's desire to see the Polish resistance destroyed, the Red Army remained passive while the city burned. The Germans responded with ferocity. They bombarded Warsaw with artillery, tanks, and airstrikes. Elite SS troops were brought in, massacring civilians in retribution. Whole districts were systematically destroyed. The resistance, outgunned and outnumbered, fought with a desperate bravery, using the city's ruins to launch ambushes and counterattacks. Yet hope was not easily extinguished. For weeks, the resistance held out. Even as their ammunition ran low and their supplies dwindled, they maintained their defiance. Radio broadcasts from the city became a voice of courage, calling for Allied help that never came. Young couriers, some as young as 12, ran through bullet-swept streets, delivering messages and supplies. But by early October, the situation became untenable. Food was exhausted, the wounded were dying without medicine, and the German bombardment never ceased. With no prospect of victory and in order to save the remaining civilians, the resistance was forced to surrender on October 2, 1944. Warsaw was left a smoldering ruin. Over 200,000 Poles, mostly civilians, had died. The city itself was systematically destroyed by the Germans in retaliation. And yet, the spirit of the Polish people survived. The Warsaw Uprising became a symbol of national pride and sacrifice, a story of courage in the face of impossible odds. The Night Witches, Soviet women pilots who terrorized Nazis. In the darkness of the Eastern Front, where the skies were a battleground and the earth was stained with blood, there emerged a group of aviators unlike any other, the Night Witches. Officially known as the 588th Night Bomber Regiment of the Soviet Air Force, this unit was composed entirely of young women who became a nightmare for the Nazi invaders. These women, many of them just teenagers when they volunteered, flew outdated Polikarpov P-2 biplanes. Slow, flimsy craft made of canvas and wood, originally intended for crop dusting. But in their hands, these biplanes became weapons of terror. Flying by night, they would cut their engines as they neared their targets, gliding silently through the darkness. The only warning the Germans received was the faint, ghostly whisper of their approach, like the sound of a witch's broomstick, as the terrified Nazis described it. Their missions were among the most dangerous of the war. The Night Witches flew without parachutes, knowing that if their planes were hit, they would have no way to escape. They flew in tight formations, drawing enemy searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, before splitting up and attacking in waves. Their courage and skill were legendary. Over 23,000 sorties were flown by the Night Witches. They dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions, supply depots, and ammunition dumps. Their accuracy was astounding, and their resilience was unmatched. Even when their planes were damaged, they brought them back, often riddled with bullet holes. Despite the condescension of some of their male counterparts and the brutal conditions they faced, the Night Witches earned the respect of the Soviet High Command. Dozens were decorated as heroes of the Soviet Union, the highest honor available. But their true legacy was not just in the bombs they dropped or the fear they inspired, but in their defiance of expectations. They were not just women, they were warriors. Audie Murphy, America's most decorated soldier. Audie Murphy's story is one of a Texas farm boy who rose to become the most decorated American soldier of World War II. Born into poverty, Murphy lied about his age to enlist at just 17. His slight frame and boyish looks earned him rejection from the Marines and the Navy, but the Army finally accepted him. Murphy's courage became legendary. Fighting across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and France, he displayed a fearless tenacity that defied his slight stature. His most famous moment came in January 1945, near Holtzwihr, France. As his unit was being overwhelmed by a German assault, Murphy climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and, alone, held off waves of enemy soldiers. For over an hour, he called in artillery strikes and fired a machine gun, mowing down attackers. By the war's end, Murphy had earned 33 medals, including the Medal of Honor. But his battles did not end in Europe. Haunted by nightmares and suffering from what we now know as PTSD, he struggled with life after the war. Yet he found a new path in Hollywood, becoming a successful actor and using his fame to advocate for veterans. Audie Murphy remains a symbol of raw courage and resilience, a testament to how even the unlikeliest heroes can rise to greatness. The Monuments Men, Saving Europe's Art. As the world was consumed by the flames of World War II, another battle raged beneath the surface, a battle to save the soul of civilization itself. This was the mission of the Monuments Men, an extraordinary group of scholars, curators, architects, and historians who traded their academic robes for military uniforms and ventured into the chaos of war to rescue Europe's greatest cultural treasures. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Program, MFAA, was established in 1943 under the Allied command, its mission simple but daunting: to protect and recover the priceless works of art, manuscripts, sculptures, and cultural artifacts that had been plundered or threatened with destruction by the Nazis. Led by men like George Stout, James Rorimer, and Rose Valland, the Monuments men were vastly outnumbered and under-resourced, but they were driven by an unwavering sense of duty. Their task was immense. The Nazis had looted vast collections of art from occupied territories, stockpiling them in hidden depots across Europe. In castles, salt mines, and even underground tunnels. Adolf Hitler, a failed artist himself, dreamed of creating a massive Führermuseum in Linz, Austria, where the greatest masterpieces would be displayed. To that end, his forces seized everything from Renaissance paintings to ancient sculptures. The Monuments men followed the front lines, risking their lives as they entered bombed-out cities and enemy-occupied zones. They negotiated with local commanders, directed Allied troops to avoid bombing historic landmarks, and tracked down rumors of hidden art caches. One of their most dramatic discoveries came in the Alta Sea salt mine in Austria, where thousands of stolen works were concealed, including masterpieces by Vermeer, Michelangelo, and Rembrandt. But the Monuments men were not only concerned with preserving art. They were also committed to ensuring that these treasures were returned to their rightful owners. In a war defined by mass destruction, they became a symbol of hope, proving that civilization itself could be saved from the darkness. Their story was not without loss. Some of the Monuments men died in the line of duty. Many of the stolen works were never recovered, lost in the chaos of war. Yet the legacy of the Monuments men endures. Their courage preserved the cultural heritage of Europe, and their story remains a testament to the idea that even in the darkest times, beauty, history, and humanity can be defended. The Great Escape, a daring prison break. In the freezing winter of 1944, deep in Nazi-occupied Poland, the air was thick with secrecy, whispers, and the scent of wet earth. Inside Stalag Luft III, a German prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen, a plan was taking shape. A plan that would become one of the most famous prison breaks in history. This was the Great Escape. Stalag Luft III was considered an escape-proof camp. The Germans, aware of the escape skills of Allied airmen, had built the camp with escape prevention in mind. The barracks were raised off the ground to prevent tunneling. The sand beneath the camp was bright yellow, making any displaced dirt obvious, and guard towers stood watch over every corner. But the prisoners were undeterred. Led by squadron leader Roger Bushell, known as Big X, a secret network of forgers, tailors, engineers, and diggers was organized. They planned to dig 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. These tunnels would be deep, supported by wooden beams and lined with electrical lights. The earth dug from the tunnels was disposed of secretly, hidden in the prisoners' trousers and scattered around the camp during daily exercise. For months, the escape committee worked in secrecy. Maps were forged, fake travel documents were prepared, and civilian clothing was sewn together from blankets. The work was dangerous, with the constant threat of discovery. But the prisoners were determined. On the night of March 24, 1944, the escape began. 76 men crawled through the narrow, suffocating tunnel of Harry. But just before the 77th man could escape, a guard noticed the tunnel exit. The alarm was raised, and the camp was locked down. Of the 76 who escaped, only 3 managed to reach freedom. The others were captured, and in a brutal reprisal, 50 of them were executed on Hitler's orders. But even in tragedy, the Great Escape became a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and the unbreakable human spirit. The Battle of Stalingrad, the blood-soaked turning point. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a clash of armies. It was a brutal, apocalyptic struggle that consumed an entire city and became a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the horror of total war. From August 1942 to February 1943, German and Soviet forces fought tooth and nail over the shattered ruins of Stalingrad, a sprawling industrial city on the banks of the Volga River. Hitler was obsessed with capturing Stalingrad, both for its strategic position and for the psychological blow it would deliver to the Soviet Union, as the city bore Stalin's name. But for the Soviet defenders, it was a matter of survival and honor. They were ordered to hold the city at any cost, and they did so with unimaginable courage. The battle began with a massive German aerial bombardment that turned Stalingrad into a burning wasteland. But the Soviets dug in among the rubble, turning every street, every building, and even the sewers into a fortress. Snipers, like the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, turned the ruined city into a deadly maze for the German invaders. The fighting was savage, with soldiers engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the wreckage of factories and apartment blocks. The turning point came in November 1942, when the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that encircled the German Sixth Army. Cut off and surrounded in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, the Germans suffered starvation, frostbite, and relentless Soviet assaults. Desperate pleas for supplies went unanswered, and even as the situation became hopeless, Hitler ordered his troops to fight to the last man. On February 2, 1943, what remained of the German Sixth Army surrendered. Of the 300,000 men who had marched into Stalingrad, only about 91,000 survived to become prisoners, and only a fraction of them would ever return home. The Battle of Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Nazi Germany and a turning point in the war. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and marked the beginning of the Soviet advance toward Berlin. The Doolittle Raid, America Strikes Back. In the dark days after Pearl Harbor, as American forces reeled from a series of humiliating defeats, one bold operation restored hope and demonstrated that the United States would not be cowed. This was the Doolittle Raid, a daring air raid on Tokyo itself, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers, stripped down to reduce weight, were launched from the deck of the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. A feat never before attempted. Their mission was to strike Japanese cities, including Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe. The goal was not only to inflict damage but to shatter the illusion of Japanese invulnerability. The raid was a logistical and tactical gamble. The bombers had to launch much farther from Japan than planned, leaving them with barely enough fuel to reach safe territory in China after dropping their bombs. Nevertheless, the Doolittle raiders pressed on, flying low over Japan to avoid detection. The bombers struck their targets, causing damage and setting fires. Though the material destruction was limited, the psychological impact was immense. The Japanese were shocked that American planes could strike their homeland, and their leaders diverted vital resources to defend against future attacks. Meanwhile, the raid gave the American people a much-needed boost in morale. After dropping their bombs, the raiders flew toward China, but many ran out of fuel and crashed. Some were captured by Japanese forces and executed, while others were rescued by Chinese villagers who paid a brutal price for their heroism. Doolittle himself feared the raid had been a failure, but instead, he was celebrated as a hero, receiving the Medal of Honor. The Doolittle raid was a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the power of a bold idea. It marked the first American strike against Japan and set the stage for the long, grueling campaign that would ultimately lead to victory in the Pacific. The Siege of Leningrad, a city's endurance. In September 1941, the Nazi German army, alongside their Finnish allies, encircled the Soviet city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, beginning one of the longest and most devastating sieges in human history. For 872 days, the people of Leningrad endured a nightmare of starvation, bombardment, and unimaginable suffering, but they refused to surrender. Hitler's plan was brutal: to starve the city into submission. The siege cut off Leningrad from all supply lines, leaving its population trapped. Winter arrived early, and with it, the city plunged into darkness and despair. Food rations were reduced to starvation levels. People resorted to eating sawdust, leather belts, and even wallpaper paste. In the depths of desperation, some turned to cannibalism, a grim, unspeakable horror. Yet even in the face of death, the spirit of Leningrad's people never broke. Factories continued to produce weapons, artists staged concerts, and a massive ice road across the frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, became a lifeline, bringing in a trickle of food and evacuating the most vulnerable. Throughout the siege, Leningrad's defenders held the line, pushing back against relentless German assaults. The Soviet military launched several offensives to break the encirclement, but it was not until January 1944 that the Red Army finally shattered the German siege, liberating the city. By then, over 1 million civilians had perished, but Leningrad had not fallen. The siege became a symbol of Soviet resilience, a tragic tale of suffering and survival. The Battle of Midway. Turning the tide in the Pacific. In the summer of 1942, the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean became the stage for a pivotal clash between the United States and Japan. This was the Battle of Midway, a fierce and decisive naval battle that would turn the tide of the Pacific War. Japan, flush with victory after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the rapid expansion across Asia, sought to eliminate the United States as a strategic power in the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, devised a plan to lure the remaining American carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll. But American codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, intercepted and deciphered Japanese communications. They discovered the Japanese plan and prepared an ambush of their own. On June 4, 1942, as Japanese bombers attacked Midway, American carriers Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet launched a counterattack. In a dramatic series of attacks, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers by surprise, striking their decks while they were rearming their planes. Within minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze. A fourth, Hiryu, would follow soon after. The battle was a disaster for Japan. 4 of its best carriers were destroyed, along with hundreds of planes and experienced pilots. In contrast, the Americans lost only 1 carrier, the Yorktown. Midway marked the end of Japan's unchecked expansion and the beginning of the Allied counteroffensive in the Pacific. The Raid on St. Nazaire, the greatest commando raid. In March 1942, a group of British commandos launched one of the most daring and audacious raids of World War II, the Raid on St. Nazaire. Known as Operation Chariot, it was a high-risk mission to destroy the massive Normandy dry dock at the French port of St. Nazaire, which was capable of servicing the largest German battleships, including the dreaded Tirpitz. The plan was bold: a specially modified British destroyer, HMS Campbellton, packed with explosives, would ram the dock gate, while hundreds of commandos stormed the port to destroy key installations. On the night of March 28, 1942, the raiding force approached St. Nazaire under the cover of darkness. Disguised as a German ship, the Campbellton evaded detection until the last moment. Then, at full speed, it smashed into the dock gate. The commandos disembarked under heavy fire, battling German defenders in brutal close-quarters combat. They destroyed pumping stations, fuel tanks, and other critical targets. As dawn broke, the surviving commandos fought their way to the docks, desperately trying to escape. Many were killed or captured, but the mission was a success. Hours later, the explosives aboard Campbellton detonated, obliterating the dock. The destruction of the St. Nazaire dry dock meant that the Tirpitz could not be repaired there, drastically reducing the threat of the powerful battleship. The raid became a legend, a tale of bravery, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of the commandos. The Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest clash in the Pacific. As American forces closed in on Japan, they set their sights on Okinawa, a strategic island that would serve as a launching point for an invasion of the Japanese mainland. But the Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, would become one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders, numbering over 100,000, had transformed the island into a fortress. They dug into caves, constructed underground bunkers, and fortified ridgelines, determined to make the Americans pay dearly for every inch of ground. The American invasion force, consisting of more than 180,000 troops and a vast naval armada, faced a nightmare of relentless resistance. The battle raged for nearly 3 months, with brutal close-quarters combat in the island's jungles and mountains. Japanese kamikaze pilots launched suicidal attacks on American ships, sinking dozens and killing thousands of sailors. On land, the fighting was fierce and unrelenting. The Americans encountered fanatical resistance, including banzai charges and desperate last stands. But the suffering of the soldiers was matched by the suffering of Okinawa's civilians. Caught in the crossfire, they were killed by artillery shells, bombed by aircraft, or driven to suicide by Japanese propaganda that claimed the Americans would show them no mercy. By the time the battle ended in June 1945, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, along with nearly 12,000 American troops. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians had also perished. The battle demonstrated the ferocity with which Japan would defend its home islands, shaping the Allied decision to use atomic bombs to force Japan's surrender. The Enigma Code, breaking Germany's secret cipher. One of the most crucial battles of World War II was not fought on land, sea, or in the air, but in the shadowy world of cryptography. This was the battle to break the German Enigma Code, a complex encryption system used by the Nazi military to secure their communications. The Enigma machine was an ingenious device, using a series of rotating wheels and electrical circuits to scramble messages in a way that seemed impossible to decipher. The Germans believed the code was unbreakable. But at Bletchley Park in England, a team of brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and engineers, led by the genius Alan Turing, set out to prove them wrong. Turing and his team designed a massive electromechanical machine, known as the bomb, which could rapidly test Enigma's many possible settings. But it was not just technology that won the code-breaking war, it was also a battle of wits. The codebreakers exploited German mistakes, intercepted messages, and even managed to capture Enigma machines from German ships. By 1941, Bletchley Park was reading vast amounts of German military traffic, providing the Allies with a priceless advantage. The intelligence derived from Enigma, codenamed Ultra, allowed the Allies to ambush U-boats, win critical battles, and even deceive the Germans about the location of the D-Day invasion. The breaking of the Enigma code remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and Turing's work was not fully recognized until decades later. But it is now understood that the codebreakers of Bletchley Park shortened the war by as much as 2 years, saving countless lives. The Siege of Malta. A tiny island's defiance. In the heart of the Mediterranean, the tiny island of Malta became a vital stronghold for the Allies, and a target for Axis forces determined to crush it. For nearly 3 years, from 1940 to 1943, Malta was besieged, enduring a relentless bombardment by German and Italian planes. The people of Malta, both civilians and soldiers, lived in constant fear. The island cities were reduced to rubble, its ports were blockaded, and its food supplies dwindled. But Malta's defenders never wavered. British fighters, including the famous Spitfires, fought against overwhelming odds, while the island's anti-aircraft guns blazed day and night. The siege reached its darkest hour in 1942. Food became so scarce that bread was rationed, and starvation seemed imminent. But then came the arrival of the convoy known as Operation Pedestal, a desperate attempt to resupply the island. The convoy was savaged by enemy attacks, but the tanker SS Ohio, limping and heavily damaged, managed to reach Malta, bringing vital fuel and supplies. Malta survived, and its role as an unsinkable aircraft carrier allowed the Allies to launch strikes against Axis shipping, disrupting their supply lines to North Africa. In recognition of their heroism, the entire population of Malta was awarded the George Cross for bravery. The Siege of Malta became a story of courage, sacrifice, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The Battle of El Alamein, turning the tide in North Africa. In the desolate, wind-swept desert of North Africa, a decisive clash unfolded between the forces of Nazi Germany, led by the legendary General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and the British Eighth Army, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery. This was the Battle of El Alamein, a brutal and pivotal conflict that would mark the beginning of the end for Axis ambitions in Africa. Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, a vital lifeline for the British Empire. But Montgomery, newly appointed to command, transformed his battered army into a disciplined and determined fighting force. Reinforced with fresh troops, tanks, and artillery, the British were ready for a showdown. On October 23, 1942, Montgomery launched his assault. Artillery roared, tanks surged forward, and British infantry slogged through deadly minefields known as the Devil's Gardens. Rommel's forces fought with tenacity, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and critically short of supplies. The desert became a hellscape of burning vehicles, shattered fortifications, and fierce, close-quarters combat. As the days dragged on, the weight of British firepower took its toll. Rommel, suffering from illness and facing inevitable defeat, was forced to retreat. By November 4, the Afrika Korps was in full retreat, and the Allies pursued them relentlessly. El Alamein was a catastrophe for Hitler's plans in Africa. It marked the first major Allied victory against the Axis, a turning point that paved the way for the Allied invasion of Italy and the final destruction of Axis forces in North Africa. The Battle of Britain, Defenders of the Skies. In the summer of 1940, as Nazi Germany swept across Europe, Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. Hitler planned to invade, but first, he needed to destroy the British Royal Air Force, RAF. What followed was the Battle of Britain, an epic aerial struggle that would determine the fate of the free world. The Luftwaffe, Germany's mighty air force, unleashed wave after wave of bombers and fighters, targeting British airfields, radar stations, and cities. British pilots, many barely out of their teens, scrambled to intercept the enemy. In their sleek Spitfires and rugged Hurricanes, they engaged the Germans in deadly dogfights over the English countryside. Outnumbered but not outmatched, the RAF used brilliant tactics, including the revolutionary use of radar to detect incoming raids. British pilots showed remarkable courage, turning their vulnerable island into a fortress in the sky. Civilians endured nightly bombings in London and other cities, a period known as the Blitz, but their spirit never broke. By October 1940, the Luftwaffe was exhausted. German losses mounted, and Hitler was forced to abandon his plans for invasion. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill famously declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The Battle of Britain became a symbol of resistance, a tale of heroism that inspired the world. The liberation of Paris, a city reclaimed. After 4 years of Nazi occupation, the city of Paris was liberated in August 1944 in a dramatic and joyous climax. The liberation of Paris was not just a strategic victory, it was a symbol of hope and freedom. The Allies, sweeping through France after the Normandy landings, bypassed Paris to focus on defeating German forces. But the French resistance, unwilling to wait any longer, rose up against the occupying forces. Barricades appeared in the streets, and fierce fighting erupted between resistance fighters and German troops. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French forces, urged the Allies to support the uprising. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower gave the green light, and French and American troops under General Philippe Leclerc entered the city on August 24, 1944. The next day, Paris erupted in celebration. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, waving flags, and embracing the liberators. German General Dietrich von Choltitz, who defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city, surrendered without a final fight. De Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris liberated." The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, the longest day. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, the world witnessed the beginning of one of the most massive and daring military operations in history, the Allied invasion of Normandy, better known as D-Day. For months, the Allies had prepared in secret, amassing an enormous force of over 156,000 troops, 11,000 aircraft, and nearly 7,000 ships. Their objective was clear but daunting: to breach Hitler's Fortress Europe and begin the liberation of Nazi-occupied France. The invasion was meticulously planned. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Allies created a massive deception plan, Operation Fortitude, designed to mislead the Germans about the true invasion point. Fake armies, led by the flamboyant General George Patton, were set up in southeast England, convincing German intelligence that the landings would occur at Pas-de-Calais. On the night of June 5, paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with British and Canadian airborne units, were dropped behind enemy lines. Their mission was to capture key bridges, destroy German artillery, and sow chaos among the defenders. The night sky was filled with flares, tracer rounds, and burning aircraft as the paratroopers fought their way through hedgerows and villages. At dawn, the main assault began. Allied warships unleashed a ferocious bombardment on the German defenses along the coast. Then, wave after wave of landing craft surged toward the beaches, codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The landings were a brutal, chaotic bloodbath, especially at Omaha Beach, where American troops faced withering machine gun fire, artillery, and deadly obstacles planted in the surf. Men waded ashore under a hail of bullets, struggling through chest-deep water while comrades fell around them. Landing craft were blown apart, and the sea ran red with blood. Yet despite the carnage, the troops pressed forward. Heroic acts were everywhere. Medics braved gunfire to save the wounded, engineers blew gaps in the barbed wire, and officers rallied their men in the face of overwhelming fire. On the British and Canadian beaches, the fighting was also fierce, but the attackers gradually pushed inland, capturing villages and knocking out German strongpoints. By the end of the day, despite horrific losses, particularly at Omaha, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold in Normandy. But D-Day was just the beginning. The Allies now had to expand their beachhead, fight through the deadly bocage, hedgerow country, and capture key objectives like the vital port of Cherbourg. The Battle of Normandy would become a brutal, grinding conflict, as German panzer divisions counterattacked and Allied bombers devastated French towns to drive out the defenders. The invasion of Normandy was a staggering achievement, a testament to the courage of the men who stormed the beaches, the brilliance of Allied planning, and the resilience of the soldiers who turned a narrow beachhead into a gateway to the liberation of Western Europe. It was the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Battle of Kursk, the greatest tank battle in history. In the summer of 1943, the rolling plains of Russia became the stage for the largest tank battle in history, the Battle of Kursk. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, Hitler was desperate to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. His plan was Operation Citadel, a massive offensive to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in a giant pincer movement around the Kursk salient. The Germans assembled a colossal force of nearly 900,000 men, 2,700 tanks, and 2,000 aircraft, including the fearsome Tiger and Panther tanks. The Soviets, however, were ready. They had intercepted German plans and transformed the Kursk region into a fortress. Hundreds of miles of trenches, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions awaited the Nazi onslaught. On July 5, 1943, the German assault began. Their tanks rumbled forward, smashing through Soviet lines with overwhelming firepower. But progress was slow. Soviet artillery and minefields took a deadly toll on the advancing panzers, while the Red Air Force harassed German columns from above. The climax came at Prokhorovka on July 12, where thousands of tanks clashed in a swirling, chaotic melee. Soviet T-34s, fast and maneuverable, swarmed the more heavily armored German Tigers. Shells screamed across the battlefield, tanks exploded in fireballs, and the ground shook under the weight of the armored behemoths. Despite initial successes, the Germans were ground down by the sheer scale of Soviet defenses and relentless counterattacks. The Red Army, reinforced with fresh troops and tanks, launched a massive counteroffensive. Hitler, facing mounting losses and an Allied invasion of Sicily, called off the attack. The Battle of Kursk was a devastating defeat for Nazi Germany. They lost over 200,000 men and more than 700 tanks. For the Soviets, it was a victory bought with immense sacrifice, but it marked a decisive shift. From this point forward, the Red Army would drive relentlessly westward, pushing the Nazis back toward Berlin. The Siege of Bastogne, Courage under Siege. Amid the bitter cold of December 1944, the town of Bastogne in Belgium became the epicenter of one of the most desperate and heroic struggles of World War II. The Siege of Bastogne was part of the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West, a surprise assault designed to split the Allied lines and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, known as the Screaming Eagles, was rushed to Bastogne to hold the strategically vital crossroads town. But as the German panzers and infantry surged forward, Bastogne was quickly surrounded. Cut off, outnumbered, and outgunned, the American paratroopers faced freezing temperatures, dwindling supplies, and relentless German attacks. On December 22, a German officer approached the American lines under a flag of truce, delivering an ultimatum: surrender or face annihilation. General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st, replied with a single word: nuts. It was a defiant, mocking refusal that became legendary. As the siege dragged on, the American soldiers dug into the snow and mud, holding their foxholes against waves of German assaults. Tanks roared through the woods, artillery thundered, and the skies were dark with the smoke of burning buildings. Yet the men of the 101st refused to give ground. Then, on December 26, salvation came in the form of General George S. Patton's Third Army. In a lightning march through the snowbound Ardennes, Patton's tanks smashed through the German lines, relieving the besieged defenders of Bastogne. The Siege of Bastogne became a symbol of American courage and determination, a story of ordinary soldiers who defied overwhelming odds to hold the line. General McAuliffe's defiant "nuts" became a rallying cry, and the 101st Airborne stand at Bastogne went down in history as a tale of grit, heroism, and unyielding resolve. The Battle of Iwo Jima, raising the flag. In the gray mist of February 1945, the island of Iwo Jima emerged from the Pacific Ocean like a volcanic fortress. A vital stronghold for the Japanese and a stepping stone for the Americans on their path to Japan. The Battle of Iwo Jima would become one of the most brutal and iconic battles of the Pacific War. The island was a fortress. Beneath its black volcanic sands, the Japanese had constructed an extensive network of bunkers, tunnels, and artillery positions. Over 21,000 Japanese soldiers, under the command of General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, were prepared to fight to the death. Kuribayashi's strategy was clear: inflict maximum casualties on the Americans, make every inch of ground a bloodbath. On February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marines landed on the beaches under a storm of artillery and machine gun fire. The black sand offered no cover, and the initial waves suffered horrific losses. Marines charged forward, clawing their way up the ashen slopes, clearing bunkers with flamethrowers, grenades, and sheer courage. The Japanese fought with suicidal tenacity, launching banzai charges and deadly ambushes. The struggle for Iwo Jima was a nightmare of close-quarters combat. The Marines had to root out defenders from caves and tunnels one by one, a slow, agonizing process that turned every hill and ridge into a killing ground. Amid the carnage, a moment of hope emerged on February 23, when a group of Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. The photograph of this moment, captured by Joe Rosenthal, became one of the most iconic images of the war. But the battle was far from over. The fighting raged on for weeks. Casualties mounted as the Americans pushed relentlessly northward. The Japanese, true to their commander's orders, fought to the last man. Only a few hundred Japanese soldiers were captured alive. When the island was finally secured after 36 days of bitter combat, over 6,800 American Marines had died, and nearly 20,000 Japanese lay dead. But Iwo Jima had been captured. It became a vital airbase for American bombers and a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of the Marines who fought there. The Battle of Iwo Jima was a brutal, tragic, and heroic chapter in the Pacific War, a place where ordinary men performed extraordinary deeds under the shadow of death. The Battle of Monte Cassino. The gateway to Rome. High in the mountains of central Italy, an ancient monastery stood as a silent sentinel, Monte Cassino, a place of prayer and peace for centuries. But in 1944, it became a fortress, a symbol of resistance, and the scene of one of the most brutal battles of World War II. The German Gustav Line stretched across Italy, a formidable barrier that halted the Allied advance. At the heart of this line stood Monte Cassino, a rocky, fortified mountain defended by elite German paratroopers. The Allies knew they had to break this line to reach Rome, but it would not be easy. In January 1944, the Allies launched the first of 4 assaults on Monte Cassino. Artillery thundered day and night, but the German defenders, dug into caves and bunkers, held firm. Allied troops from around the world, Americans, British, French, Polish, Indians, New Zealanders, and more, struggled up the steep, rocky slopes under relentless machine gun fire. The monastery itself became a focal point. Believing it was being used as a German stronghold, the Allies made a fateful decision. On February 15, 1944, waves of American bombers reduced the ancient monastery to rubble. But instead of breaking the German defense, the destruction gave them even better cover among the ruins. The battle raged for months. Men fought hand-to-hand in the shattered rocks, tanks struggled to climb narrow mountain paths, and the mountain became a charnel house. Rain turned the slopes into a quagmire, and the air was filled with smoke, dust, and the screams of the wounded. It was the Polish II Corps that finally broke the German defense in May 1944. Fighting with extraordinary bravery, they climbed the ruins, inch by bloody inch, until at last, the white and red Polish flag flew over the shattered monastery. The Battle of Monte Cassino cost the Allies over 55,000 casualties. The Germans lost around 20,000. But the Gustav Line was breached, and the road to Rome was open. Monte Cassino became a symbol of sacrifice, a place where soldiers from many nations bled together in the shadow of an ancient abbey. The Battle of Berlin, the fall of the Third Reich. In the spring of 1945, the end of the Third Reich was written in fire and blood on the streets of Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was the final, desperate struggle of Nazi Germany, a brutal urban combat where every street, building, and cellar became a battlefield. The Soviet Red Army, over 2 million strong, encircled the city. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces attacked from the east, while Marshal Ivan Konev's armies struck from the south. The city's defenders were a mix of hardened SS veterans, desperate Wehrmacht troops, elderly men from the Volkssturm, and young boys of the Hitler Youth. On April 16, 1945, the Soviet assault began with a thunderous artillery barrage, the earth-shaking roar of thousands of guns. Soviet tanks, covered in infantry, smashed through the outer defenses, while German soldiers fought from trenches, bunkers, and hastily built barricades. The battle raged through the city, transforming grand boulevards into rubble-strewn killing grounds. Soviet soldiers advanced building by building, room by room, using grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets. The German defenders fought with the desperation of the doomed, knowing there was nowhere left to retreat. Amid the chaos, Adolf Hitler remained in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. His dreams of a 1,000-year Reich had crumbled to ash, and his orders grew increasingly erratic. On April 30, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Hitler committed suicide alongside his wife, Eva Braun. But the battle did not end with his death. German forces continued to resist until May 2, when General Helmuth Weidling, the city's commander, finally surrendered. The Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, a symbol of final victory. The Battle of Berlin claimed the lives of over 80,000 Soviet soldiers and around 100,000 German defenders, along with tens of thousands of civilians. The city lay in ruins, a shattered landscape of burned buildings, cratered streets, and the corpses of soldiers and civilians alike. Yet amid the devastation, the war in Europe was finally over. The Nazi regime was destroyed, and a new world order was about to emerge from the ashes of Berlin. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest struggle of the war. The cold, gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean became a vast and deadly battlefield during World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the war, a struggle for control of the vital shipping lanes that kept Britain alive. At the heart of the battle were the German U-boats, deadly submarines that prowled the Atlantic, hunting Allied convoys. Organized into wolf packs, these submarines could strike without warning, their torpedoes ripping through the hulls of merchant ships, sending sailors into the freezing sea. The Allies fought back with everything they had, destroyers armed with depth charges, escort carriers launching patrol aircraft, and the crucial work of codebreakers at Bletchley Park who deciphered the German Enigma code, giving Allied convoys a fighting chance. For sailors on the convoys, life was a constant nightmare. Icy winds lashed the decks, waves crashed over the bows, and death could come at any moment from a torpedo's sudden, fiery impact. Ships vanished without a trace, and survivors floated for hours in the frigid water, clinging to life rafts, praying for rescue. The turning point came in 1943. Allied aircraft, equipped with long-range radar, began to hunt U-boats from the air. Improved sonar and new tactics helped destroy hundreds of German submarines. The hunters became the hunted. By the end of the battle, over 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 warships had been sunk, along with nearly 800 German U-boats. Tens of thousands of sailors died, but the Allies held the Atlantic. Supplies continued to flow, and Britain remained in the fight. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a struggle of ships and submarines. It was a battle of endurance, courage, and survival. It was a story of men who braved the icy depths and the endless horizon, knowing that death could come at any moment, but never giving up. The Dunkirk evacuation, the miracle of deliverance. In May 1940, the Allied armies in France faced catastrophe. The German Blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast assault of tanks, infantry, and aircraft, had smashed through the French defenses. British, French, Belgian, and Dutch forces were pushed back to the northern coast, trapped in a shrinking pocket around the French port of Dunkirk. As German forces closed in, it seemed that the destruction of the Allied armies was inevitable. But then, in a desperate gamble, the British launched Operation Dynamo, an audacious plan to evacuate their troops across the English Channel. But they faced a nightmare. German bombers pounded the beaches, and the narrow waters were filled with mines, U-boats, and enemy patrols. Yet out of desperation came a miracle. Thousands of small civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, ferries, and lifeboats, joined the Royal Navy in the greatest maritime evacuation in history. These little ships of Dunkirk braved bombs, machine gun fire, and the churning sea to rescue the stranded soldiers. On the beaches, British and French soldiers lined up under constant bombardment. Columns of men waded out into the cold water, waiting for rescue. Spitfires of the Royal Air Force roared overhead, battling German planes to protect the evacuation. For 9 days, the evacuation continued. Nearly 338,000 soldiers were rescued from the beaches. Far more than anyone had believed possible. Dunkirk was a defeat, but it became a symbol of hope and resilience. A disaster had been transformed into a legend. Winston Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. But it was a miracle born of courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of those who refused to give up, even in the darkest of times. The Battle of Guadalcanal, the struggle for the Solomon Islands. In the summer of 1942, a remote, jungle-covered island in the Pacific became the scene of a brutal, 6-month struggle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. This was Guadalcanal, a place of dense forests, sweltering heat, and death lurking in the shadows. The island's strategic importance was clear. Japanese forces had begun building an airfield on Guadalcanal, threatening Allied supply lines between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. In August 1942, the Allies struck back. American Marines stormed ashore, catching the Japanese by surprise. But the fight for Guadalcanal was far from over. The Japanese launched relentless counterattacks by land, sea, and air. The dense jungle became a nightmare battleground, where visibility was limited, and every shadow might hide an enemy. Disease, malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot claimed nearly as many lives as combat. At sea, the waters around Guadalcanal turned into a graveyard. Naval battles erupted in the darkness, ships shattered by torpedoes, sailors struggling in burning water. The Battle of Savo Island, Iron Bottom Sound, and others saw the loss of dozens of ships. On land, American Marines and soldiers fought with tenacity. Battles like Bloody Ridge, where a thin line of American defenders held off wave after wave of Japanese attackers, became legends. The courage of men like Sergeant John Basilone, who manned his machine gun even as enemy troops overran his position, became part of Marine Corps lore. Slowly, painfully, the tide turned. American air superiority grew, supply lines improved, and Japanese reinforcements dwindled. In February 1943, the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal, leaving behind their dead and their shattered dreams of domination. The Battle of Guadalcanal was a brutal, grinding conflict. Over 25,000 Japanese soldiers died, along with 7,000 Americans. But the victory was a turning point. The Japanese advance was halted, and the long, bloody road to Tokyo had begun. The Battle of Anzio, a bloody stalemate on the Italian coast. In January 1944, the Allied forces launched an ambitious amphibious assault on the Italian coast at Anzio, hoping to outflank the German defenses on the Gustav Line and march swiftly to Rome. But what was meant to be a bold breakthrough became a bloody, prolonged nightmare. The Allied troops landed almost unopposed, catching the Germans by surprise. But instead of advancing quickly, the Allied commander, General John P. Lucas, chose to consolidate his beachhead, allowing the Germans to regroup. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the German commander, reacted swiftly, encircling the beachhead with a ring of formidable defenses. For months, the Allies were trapped on the Anzio beachhead, enduring relentless German artillery bombardments that turned the flat coastal plain into a killing field. German counterattacks were fierce, and every inch of ground was soaked with blood. The town of Cisterna saw brutal combat, where American Rangers were surrounded and decimated. Allied soldiers dug into foxholes, enduring freezing rain, mud, and constant shelling. German snipers and machine gun nests made every advance a deadly gamble. The stalemate dragged on until May 1944, when a massive Allied offensive finally broke the German lines. The road to Rome was open, but the cost had been staggering. Over 43,000 Allied troops were killed, wounded, or missing, while the Germans lost around 40,000. The Battle of Anzio was a story of courage and suffering, of soldiers who endured hell on a narrow strip of land, fighting for every inch against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the greatest naval battle in history. In October 1944, the waters off the Philippine Islands became the scene of the greatest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. It was a colossal clash between the Japanese Imperial Navy and the United States Navy, a struggle that would decide the fate of the Pacific War. The Japanese, desperate to stop the American advance, launched Operation Shogo, a complex plan involving decoy forces, kamikaze attacks, and massive battleships. They hoped to trap and destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte. The battle was a series of interconnected naval engagements spread across the Philippine Sea. It began with the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, where American planes from Admiral William Halsey's carriers attacked and sank the Japanese superbattleship Musashi, one of the largest warships ever built. Next came the Battle of Surigao Strait, where American battleships, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, exacted vengeance. In a night of thunderous gunfire, they shattered the Japanese southern force, crossing their T in a devastating maneuver. But the fiercest clash came at the Battle off Samar, where a small American escort force, Taffy 3, faced the might of the Japanese center force led by Admiral Kurita. Outgunned and outnumbered, the American destroyers and escort carriers fought with unbelievable courage. Destroyers like USS Johnston, led by Commander Ernest E. Evans, charged the massive Japanese battleships, firing torpedoes, laying down smoke, and drawing enemy fire. Miraculously, the Japanese retreated, believing they faced a much larger force. Taffy 3's desperate courage had saved the invasion fleet. The final chapter was the Battle of Cape Engano, where American carrier planes annihilated the decoy Japanese northern force, sinking 4 aircraft carriers. By the end of the battle, the Japanese Navy was shattered. They lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and nearly a dozen destroyers. Their ability to wage a naval war was destroyed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was a decisive American victory, and the final death blow to the Japanese fleet. It was a story of heroism, sacrifice, and the overwhelming power of American naval aviation. The Siege of Warsaw, a city's desperate fight. In September 1939, as the German blitzkrieg swept across Poland, the city of Warsaw became a symbol of defiance. Surrounded and bombarded by German artillery and Luftwaffe bombers, the people of Warsaw fought with desperate courage. Under the command of General Julius Rommel, Polish soldiers, police officers, and civilian volunteers built barricades and dug trenches in the streets. Makeshift militias formed, and the citizens turned every building into a fortress. Despite being outgunned and outnumbered, they fought back against German tanks and infantry. The siege was brutal. German bombers pounded the city day and night, turning entire neighborhoods into smoking ruins. Fires swept through the city, and water supplies ran low. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. But the spirit of Warsaw remained unbroken. Women and children carried ammunition to the front lines. Boys too young to fight became messengers, darting through the shattered streets under enemy fire. The defenders managed to destroy several German tanks with Molotov cocktails and captured artillery. But the odds were impossible. On September 27, after 20 days of fierce resistance, the defenders of Warsaw were forced to surrender. The city was devastated, and nearly 20,000 civilians lay dead in the rubble. Yet the courage of Warsaw's defenders became a legend. It showed the world that even in the face of overwhelming force, a city could stand and fight for its freedom. And for the Polish people, it was a reminder that their spirit could never be crushed. The Battle of Crete, a paratrooper's nightmare. In May 1941, the island of Crete became the scene of one of the most dramatic battles of World War II, the first major airborne invasion in history. Codenamed Operation Mercury, it was Germany's bold plan to seize Crete using paratroopers and glider troops. The attack began with a sky full of German planes, thousands of paratroopers descending through clouds of anti-aircraft fire. But from the moment they landed, they faced a nightmare. Allied defenders. British, Australian, New Zealand, and Greek soldiers, along with armed Cretan civilians, fought with ferocious resistance. German paratroopers landed directly into kill zones, many of them mowed down before they even hit the ground. Others were ambushed in the olive groves, where Cretan farmers, armed with knives, axes, and old rifles, fought them savagely. But the Germans were relentless. Despite horrendous casualties, they captured the airfields at Maleme, which allowed them to bring in reinforcements. The Allies were gradually forced to fall back. In the town of Heraklion, British troops and local resistance fighters turned every street into a fortress. Fierce house-to-house combat erupted, with Germans facing a stubborn and fearless enemy. The battle raged for 13 brutal days. In the end, the island fell to the Germans, but at a terrible cost. Over 4,000 German paratroopers were killed, and many of their elite units were shattered. Hitler was horrified by the losses and declared that Germany would never again attempt a large-scale airborne invasion. For the Allies, Crete was a tragic defeat, but the courage of its defenders became a legend. The Battle of Singapore, the fall of the impregnable fortress. In February 1942, the British stronghold of Singapore, regarded as an impregnable fortress, fell to the Japanese in one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Singapore's defenders included British, Australian, Indian, and local troops, but they were poorly coordinated, and morale was low. Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita launched a lightning invasion, using bicycles to move rapidly through the dense Malayan jungles. The Japanese overwhelmed British defences in Malaya, driving the defenders back to the island of Singapore. British General Arthur Percival believed the main attack would come from the sea, so he fortified the coastal defences. But Yamashita struck from the landward side, crossing the Johor Strait under the cover of darkness. Japanese bombers pounded the city, while their infantry stormed across. The British defenders, outflanked and running out of supplies, were pushed back into the city. On February 15, after only a week of brutal fighting on the island itself, Percival surrendered. Over 80,000 Allied troops became prisoners of war, the largest British surrender in history. The fall of Singapore shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia and emboldened Japan's expansion across the Pacific. It was a story of leadership failure, misjudgment, and the devastating consequences of underestimating an enemy. Operation Anthropoid, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. In the chill of a Prague morning on May 27, 1942, history took a sharp and defiant turn. Two young men waited nervously beside a sharp bend on a quiet road in the Liban district. They were Jan Kubis and Josef Gabčík, Czechoslovak patriots trained by the British Special Operations Executive. Their target was one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany. Reinhard Heydrich, the Butcher of Prague, the architect of the final solution, and one of Hitler's most ruthless enforcers. Operation Anthropoid was one of the most daring and dangerous missions of the war. After the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, Hitler installed Heydrich as Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia. A cold, efficient, and brutal administrator, Heydrich quickly crushed resistance, imposed martial law, and executed thousands. His iron-fisted rule earned him a reputation of near-mythic terror. But the Czechoslovak government in exile, operating from London, saw his assassination as both a strategic necessity and a symbolic act of resistance. Parachuted into the occupied homeland in December 1941, Kubis and Gabčík endured months of hardship, hiding in safe houses, liaising with underground networks, constantly pursued by the Gestapo. The resistance was fractured and demoralized, fearful of retribution. Yet they persisted. On that fateful morning, Heydrich was riding in an open-top Mercedes, a reflection of his arrogance. He believed himself invincible. As the car slowed at the bend, Gabčík stepped forward, machine gun in hand, and pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The gun jammed. In that tense moment, Heydrich ordered his driver to stop. Instead of fleeing, he stepped out, pistol drawn, to confront the would-be assassins. Kubis, thinking fast, hurled a modified anti-tank grenade. It exploded beside the car, sending shrapnel into Heydrich's side. Though the injuries initially seemed survivable, Heydrich's spleen was punctured. He was taken to a hospital where he lingered for days. Infection set in. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died from septicemia. The Nazi response was swift and savage. Hitler was incensed. Whole villages were wiped off the map. The town of Lidice was razed to the ground, men were shot, women sent to Ravensbrück, children gassed or dispersed. Thousands were rounded up, tortured, and executed. The Czech resistance was nearly annihilated. The assassins themselves, along with 5 other agents, were betrayed weeks later and cornered in the crypt of the Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. The Gestapo flooded the building with water and gunfire. After hours of desperate fighting, the last survivors took their own lives rather than be captured. Operation Anthropoid was a Pyrrhic victory. Its immediate cost was staggering. But in the long arc of the war, it changed perception. It showed that even the most feared Nazis could be struck down. It rallied the Czech nation and contributed to the Allies' growing recognition of the resistance's role in the war. The men who planned and carried out the operation knew they would likely die. But in choosing defiance over submission, they wrote themselves into the pages of history not as victims of tyranny, but as its executioners. The Nightingales of Paris, how a network of women helped break the Nazi grip on France. By 1941, the streets of Paris no longer echoed with jazz and laughter. The black-booted march of the Wehrmacht had silenced much of the city's joy. Yet beneath the polished shoes of the occupiers and the banners of the swastika, something quiet was stirring. Letters, messages, maps, and whispers passed in shadowed alleys and behind the closed doors of cafes and sewing parlors. In this world of shadows, women played a role far greater than history often records. One such network, known quietly as Les Rossignols, the Nightingales, wove together one of the most vital, invisible lifelines of the French resistance. The Nightingales were not soldiers. They were librarians, schoolteachers, nurses, laundresses, and students. What made them powerful was their invisibility. The Gestapo rarely suspected women, especially those appearing to conform to traditional roles. These women turned that assumption into a weapon. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, codenamed Harrison, the Hedgehog, was one of the resistance's most unlikely leaders. Elegant, intelligent, and cool-headed, she commanded the Alliance network, which passed intelligence to the British. Under her leadership, dozens of women became message carriers, code breakers, and safe house organizers. They memorized entire train schedules, detailed German troop movements, and learned to encode messages in knitting patterns or music scores. In one mission, a young opera singer named Colette used her nightly performances as cover for carrying microfilm, hiding vital Allied intelligence inside the heel of her shoe. She would sing for German officers in smoky clubs, smile graciously, and then disappear into the fog-choked streets to hand off documents to a courier by the Seine. Another woman, Yvonne Roudelat, a British-French agent, operated under the codename Jacqueline. She rode a bicycle across hundreds of miles of occupied countryside, delivering messages, explosives, and even radio equipment, sometimes hiding it in loaves of bread or under her clothing. Arrested in 1943 and tortured for days, she never gave up a single name. She died in a concentration camp, never knowing that her information had helped the Allies prepare for the D-Day landings. Perhaps the most remarkable moment of the Nightingales came in the summer of 1944, as the Allied forces prepared to break through Normandy. Thanks to women embedded in the German military offices in Paris, secretaries who copied classified orders at great personal risk, the resistance learned the Wehrmacht's plans to defend key bridges and fuel depots. This intelligence was passed to the British SIS and directly influenced the bombing raids that weakened German logistics before the invasion. These women rarely received medals. Their stories were often silenced in the post-war narratives dominated by male generals and battlefield glory. Yet they were the arteries of the resistance, carrying not just messages, but courage, resolve, and the unbreakable will of a people who refused to be conquered. Paris was eventually liberated in August 1944. As the bells rang out across the city once more, many of the Nightingales simply returned to their quiet lives. The war had passed through them, but they carried no banners, no rifles, only the knowledge that their silence had shaped the future. Death in the Northern Lights, the Arctic convoys to Soviet Russia. There was no glory on the Arctic convoys, only cold, fear, and silence. From 1941 to 1945, Allied merchant ships braved the frigid waters between Britain and the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, bringing with them the steel sinews of war, tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, and food. These icy corridors, cut through oceans patrolled by German submarines, aircraft, and warships, were part of a desperate gamble to keep the Eastern Front alive. The decision to supply the Soviet Union came after Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, when Hitler broke the Nazi-Soviet pact and launched a massive invasion. Though the Allies and Soviets had once been ideological enemies, necessity now demanded unity. But how to reach them? The overland routes through Iran and Central Asia were slow and treacherous. The Arctic, brutal as it was, offered the most direct path, if one dared it. Convoy PQ-17 became a symbol of both the horrors and the heroism of the Arctic route. In early July 1942, 35 merchant ships, flanked by a fleet of British and American warships, set sail from Iceland toward northern Russia. They carried over 200 tanks, 600 aircraft, and thousands of tons of cargo critical to the Red Army's survival. But they also sailed into a trap. Unknown to the convoy's commanders, German intelligence had learned of the mission. Lurking in Norway was the battleship Tirpitz, sister ship of the Bismarck, supported by U-boats and long-range bombers. British Admiralty, fearing annihilation, gave the fateful and controversial order on July 4, scatter. The escorts turned away. The merchant ships, unprotected, became prey. For days, German aircraft rained bombs down from gray skies while wolf packs of U-boats circled in the deep. One by one, the ships burned and sank. Men died in seconds from torpedoes or slowly from exposure. The Arctic showed no mercy. Survivors who made it into lifeboats often froze to death within minutes. The water temperature was rarely above freezing. Even those pulled from the sea found their wet clothing frozen solid to their bodies. In the end, only 11 of the 35 ships reached Russia. Over 150 merchant sailors died. The loss was staggering, and morale plummeted. Critics accused the Admiralty of panic, and PQ-17 became synonymous with sacrifice and disaster. And yet, the convoys continued. Convoy after convoy sailed, often in complete darkness to avoid the Luftwaffe. Crews chipped ice from decks with axes to prevent ships from capsizing. Lookouts stood on watch until their eyelids froze shut. They watched the aurora borealis shimmer in the distance while scanning for the periscope's glint or the silhouette of a bomber. Despite staggering losses, these convoys delivered more than 4 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union, enough to outfit entire armies. Sherman tanks, American jeeps, British radar systems, even Spam and powdered milk, all helped fuel the Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually turn the tide at Stalingrad and Kursk. Churchill called the Arctic convoys the worst journey in the world, and with good reason. They never attracted headlines like Normandy or El Alamein. There were no victory parades for the men who sailed into ice and fire. But without them, the Red Army might have been starved of the means to fight. Those convoys were a silent pact, a frozen alliance between men who never met, across languages and ideologies. They proved that war is not always won by thunderous charges or grand speeches, but sometimes by endurance, grit, and the will to sail into the storm. The Mountain Rebellion, Tito and the Yugoslav partisans. In the broken spine of the Dinaric Alps, under the smoke-choked sky of Axis-occupied Yugoslavia, a strange and savage war was unfolding. It was not fought in open battlefields or with the pomp of marching armies. It was fought in ravines and forests, in stone villages and highland passes, where a guerrilla army of peasants, miners, students, and teachers bled the German war machine dry. They called themselves the Partisans, and their leader was a man known simply as Tito. After the Axis powers invaded and dismembered Yugoslavia in April 1941, the country was carved into puppet states and occupation zones by Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria. The independent state of Croatia, NDH, under the fascist Ustase regime, launched a brutal campaign of genocide against Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Chaos reigned. The royal government fled. Resistance was left to the people, and resistance rose. At first, there were many factions. The Chetniks, royalist Serb nationalists under Draza Mihailovic, operated in some regions but hesitated to fight the Germans directly, fearing reprisals. Then came the Partisans, communist-led and explicitly multi-ethnic. Under Tito's leadership, they formed not just a rebel force, but a movement, a vision of a new Yugoslavia born in fire. Tito, born Josip Broz, was a machinist by trade and a revolutionary by destiny. Charismatic, ruthless, and cunning, he moved between mountain strongholds with a keen sense of timing and terrain. His partisans struck railroads, ambushed convoys, sabotaged depots. They didn't hold ground, they made the enemy pay for every step. They called it the War of the Flea, and it drove the Nazis to fury. The Germans responded with savagery. Entire villages were razed in retaliation. Civilians were rounded up and shot by the thousands. But for every massacre, the ranks of the partisans grew. From the Dalmatian coast to the Bosnian hills, farmers and factory workers took up arms. The forests became their barracks, caves their hospitals, caves their cathedrals. In 1942, the partisans staged the Igman March, a desperate winter escape from encirclement. Dozens froze to death crossing Mount Igman, but the survivors emerged with their morale intact. They didn't need a capital, they carried the soul of Yugoslavia in their packs. By 1943, the Allies, originally backing the Chetniks, began to shift their support. British liaison officers, including the legendary Fitzroy MacLean, parachuted into Tito's headquarters and were stunned by what they found. A disciplined, organized force, issuing its own currency, broadcasting its own radio, administering liberated territory. Tito's partisans weren't just fighters, they were a parallel government. The climax came in the summer of 1944. Operation Russelsprung, Knight's Leap, was Hitler's personal vendetta. He ordered a surprise airborne assault to capture or kill Tito in his mountain redoubt at Drvar. German paratroopers dropped from the sky, unleashing chaos. But Tito escaped through a network of tunnels and narrow trails, his famous white cap disappearing into the mist of the Bosnian forest. The Germans failed. The partisans survived. With the Red Army approaching from the east and Allied supplies now flowing in earnest, the partisans surged. By the war's end, they had liberated much of the country without direct Soviet occupation. Yugoslavia emerged not as a Soviet satellite but as a communist state with its own spine, thanks to the credibility earned in those hard mountain campaigns. Tito's Yugoslavia would later walk an independent line in the Cold War, but its foundation was built in blood and grit, by shepherds with rifles, by nurses carrying morphine through the snow, by underground presses printing leaflets in the dead of night. The partisan struggle stands as one of the most successful guerrilla resistance efforts of the entire war. It was not just a fight for liberation, it was a fight to reinvent a nation, fought by those who had nothing left to lose, and everything still to make. A Bridge Too Far, The Tragedy and Valor of Operation Market Garden. The summer of 1944 had seen one Allied victory after another. The Normandy landings were a success. Paris had been liberated. German forces were retreating across France, and morale among the Allies was high. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower was preparing a steady advance toward the German heartland. But British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a different vision, a bold stroke that would bypass the Siegfried Line, leap across the Rhine, and punch straight into Germany's industrial heart. He called it Operation Market Garden. A two-pronged offensive combining airborne and ground forces in a race through the Netherlands. Market was the codename for the airborne assault, Garden was the ground advance. The plan: 3 major rivers would be crossed in succession, the Maas, the Waal, and the Rhine, by seizing key bridges with paratroopers and linking them with a rapidly advancing armored column. If successful, it could end the war by Christmas. But the plan was as ambitious as it was risky. It relied on perfect timing, rapid coordination, and the assumption that German resistance in the Netherlands was crumbling. Reality, however, had other ideas. On September 17, 1944, the skies above Holland roared with the engines of over 2,000 aircraft as they dropped nearly 35,000 Allied paratroopers behind enemy lines. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division was to seize bridges near Eindhoven. The 82nd was tasked with Nijmegen. And the British 1st Airborne Division, under the brave but ultimately doomed command of Major General Roy Urquhart, was assigned the farthest and most critical objective, the bridge at Arnhem, spanning the Lower Rhine. From the start, the operation began to fray. The drop zones for the British 1st Airborne were far from the Arnhem Bridge, giving the Germans time to regroup. Intelligence had underestimated the presence of the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, elite and battle-hardened, refitting in the area. What was supposed to be light resistance turned into a mechanized onslaught. Despite the odds, a small contingent of British paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel John Frost managed to reach and hold the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. For 4 days, they fought with dwindling ammunition, cut off from reinforcements. German tanks and artillery pounded their positions. Communication with the rest of the division broke down. Relief was nowhere in sight. Meanwhile, the ground forces, led by the British XXX Corps, were delayed by blown bridges, narrow roads, and fierce resistance. The highway they advanced on became known as Hell's Highway, a narrow corridor exposed to constant German attacks. Every hour of delay sealed the fate of the paratroopers at Arnhem. By September 21, Frost's men were overwhelmed. The bridge, so vital to the operation's success, remained in German hands. Of the 10,000 British troops dropped at Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 would make it out. The rest were killed, captured, or missing. The Dutch town was reduced to rubble, and its civilian population suffered terrible reprisals in the following months. The failure of Market Garden had profound consequences. The war would drag on through the winter. The northern Netherlands remained under Nazi occupation. Thousands would starve in what became known as the Hunger Winter. And the Allies would have to fight inch by inch toward the Rhine in brutal campaigns still to come. But amid the failure, there was valor. The paratroopers at Arnhem held the line far longer than anyone thought possible. They fought without resupply, often resorting to scavenging weapons and rations. Civilians risked everything to hide wounded soldiers. Medics treated the dying in makeshift hospitals under shellfire. Their courage became legend. Later, when asked about the outcome, one British general would lament, "We tried to go a bridge too far." The phrase became synonymous with military overreach, but also with the bitter truth that in war, even the best plans can falter when pitted against fate, terrain, and the will of an enemy not yet defeated. Operation Market Garden did not end the war early. But it left behind stories of sacrifice, of incredible bravery in hopeless situations, and of how history can turn on a single bridge. The Frozen Counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. December 1944. Snow fell heavy across Belgium, Luxembourg, and the eastern edge of France. The Western Front had grown quiet, perhaps deceptively so. Allied commanders believed the Germans were finished, exhausted and retreating, incapable of mounting any large-scale offense. After all, Paris had been liberated. German cities were being bombed daily. The Siegfried Line had been breached. Christmas was near. But in the shadows of the Ardennes forest, Hitler was preparing a thunderclap. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. But to his generals, it was madness. His plan was to punch a hole through the American lines in the Ardennes, drive westward to Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It was audacious, reminiscent of his blitzkrieg in 1940. And it depended on surprise, speed, and terrible winter weather to ground Allied air superiority. On the morning of December 16, the offensive began. Over 200,000 German troops backed by 1,000 tanks and assault guns surged out of the forest, crashing into the thinly held American lines. Many of the U.S. troops in the region were inexperienced, having been stationed in what was considered a quiet sector. Entire units were overrun. Communications collapsed. Fog and snow concealed the attack, and for the first time in years, the Germans seized the initiative. It created a massive dent in the Allied lines, a bulge, which gave the battle its name. In the town of Bastogne, a vital crossroads, the 101st Airborne Division and other American units were quickly encircled. Supplies dwindled. Ammunition ran low. The temperature plummeted below freezing. Wounded men lay in barns with no morphine, no bandages, only the hope of holding out long enough for rescue. The Germans demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st, famously replied with a single word, "Nuts." The defiance echoed across the front. Reinforcements were coming, but they had to battle through ice, mines, and ambushes to reach Bastogne. Meanwhile, Hitler had pinned his hopes on Kampfgruppe Paper, an elite armored spearhead under SS commander Joachim Paper, to lead the drive to the Meuse River. Paper's column blazed forward, capturing American fuel depots and executing prisoners, most notoriously at Malmedy, where 84 American POWs were massacred in the snow. But the advance began to stall. The terrain favored defense. American engineers blew bridges, laid traps, and held crossroads with grim determination. Fuel shortages crippled the panzers. As the skies cleared, Allied air power returned, pounding the exposed German columns with bombs and rockets. In late December, General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, performed a feat of logistics and maneuver that would become legend. Pivoting his entire army north through icy roads, he smashed into the German flank and relieved Bastogne on December 26. The siege was broken. By early January 1945, the German offensive had failed. They had pushed the Allies back, but not far enough. They had stunned them, but not broken them. The bulge was flattened. German casualties exceeded 100,000. Tanks and men they could never replace were lost. And with them, so too was any hope of victory in the West. For the Americans, it was the largest and bloodiest battle they would fight in the European theater. Over 19,000 U.S. soldiers were killed. But their stand in the snow had proven decisive. From Bastogne to Elsenborn Ridge, it was grit, not glamour, that won the day. The Battle of the Bulge was the death throes of a regime collapsing under its own weight. But for those who endured it, in foxholes and forests, it was more than strategy or maps, it was survival. It was valor in the deep cold, under the thunder of artillery and the scream of Stukas, where lines held because men refused to let them break. And in the end, when the Ardennes was quiet once more, it was the Allies, not the Axis, who moved forward. The war was far from over, but Hitler's last gamble had been played, and it had failed. Inferno over Elbe, the firebombing of Dresden. In the early weeks of February 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act. The Red Army was storming westward across Poland, bearing down on Berlin with fury and momentum. In the west, Allied forces had crossed into Germany, closing the jaws of a vice around the Third Reich. Hitler's armies were collapsing. Defeat was inevitable. And yet, amidst this whirlwind of victory, a plan was set in motion, one that would ignite a firestorm of both literal and historical proportions. Dresden, the capital of Saxony, lay deep in eastern Germany, nestled on the banks of the Elbe River. Known as the Florence on the Elbe, it was a city of art, music, and classical architecture, a place shaped by the elegance of Canaletto's brush, the compositions of Richard Wagner, and the legacy of Augustus the Strong. Though it had some military industry and rail connections, it had largely escaped the heavy bombing that had leveled cities like Hamburg and Cologne. But now, Dresden was in the crosshairs. Allied strategic planners, particularly within the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command under Air Chief Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris, had been employing a policy of area bombing. Targeting not just factories, but cities themselves, aiming to crush German morale and industrial capacity through sheer destruction. Dresden was a junction city, a communications hub, and a waypoint for German troops retreating from the Eastern Front. It also, according to some intelligence reports, housed military stockpiles. But it was also a city swollen with refugees, tens of thousands of civilians fleeing the Red Army's advance, women, children, elderly, the injured. Crowding into churches, schools, and homes, hoping Dresden would be safe. It would not be. On the night of February 13, 1945, the first wave of bombers came. 796 RAF Lancasters, guided by Pathfinder aircraft that dropped flares to mark the target zone, roared over the city just after 10 p.m. Their cargo, high-explosive bombs, designed to shatter rooftops and windows, and more importantly, to open up structures so that the incendiaries that followed could set the city ablaze. It worked. The initial wave fractured buildings, ruptured gas mains, and destroyed the water infrastructure. Then came the second wave, just after midnight, with massive incendiary payloads, clusters of phosphorus and magnesium firebombs designed to saturate entire districts in flame. What followed was beyond comprehension. Dresden became an inferno. The fires joined into a firestorm, a self-sustaining storm of fire that consumed oxygen and created hurricane-force winds. Entire blocks ignited in seconds. People were incinerated in basements or suffocated as the air was sucked from the streets. Pavement melted. Church bells rang as they fell from burning towers. The heat reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Those who tried to flee found the streets turned to rivers of flame. Hospitals, schools, and shelters, all burned. The next morning, American B-17s from the 8th Air Force arrived to continue the bombing. Their mission was to disrupt rail lines, but with the city already in ruins, the added destruction did little but deepen the crater. For 3 days, the fires burned. When the smoke finally cleared, what was left of Dresden resembled a moonscape. The beautiful Frauenkirche was a blackened husk. The Zwinger Palace lay in ruins. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. The human cost? Estimates vary, but most agree that 25,000 people or more were killed, nearly all of them civilians. Thousands of bodies were never identified. Some were cremated in the streets, reduced to ash where they fell. The bombing of Dresden quickly became a point of contention, during the war and ever since. The Allies defended it as a legitimate military target, part of a broader strategy to hasten Germany's defeat. But others, including prominent voices like Winston Churchill himself, began to question the scale and necessity of the attack. Churchill, in a memo soon after, wrote, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing German cities simply for the sake of increasing terror, should be reviewed." In the post-war years, Dresden became a symbol of destruction, of excess, and of the moral ambiguities of total war. For the Germans, it was a trauma that never fully healed. For the Allies, it forced a reckoning. Had victory come at too high a cost? Yet amidst the ashes, there were survivors. People who crawled from cellars, dazed and burned, who rebuilt their lives from ruin. And decades later, the Frauenkirche, painstakingly reconstructed using the original stones where possible, would once again stand tall, its golden cross donated by the people of Britain. Dresden reminds us that war is not always about triumph, it is also about what is lost. The firebombing was not just a military action. It was an incineration of memory, art, and innocence. And in that blaze, humanity itself seemed to flicker on the edge. The day the sun fell, the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima stirred to life beneath a bright, cloudless sky. It was just after 7 a.m., and air raid sirens briefly wailed, a routine warning in a country now accustomed to the distant hum of enemy bombers. Most civilians paid it no mind. It was yet another false alarm. No bombers had reached Hiroshima in recent days. For many, the city felt protected, almost charmed, untouched by the waves of destruction that had already leveled Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. But Hiroshima was not chosen by chance. It was a strategic port city, a military hub, and, critically, it had been left unbombed on purpose. The US had preserved it so that the destructive power of a new, secret weapon could be measured with horrifying precision. At 8:15 a.m., the heavens tore open. Flying 6 miles above the city in the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets and his crew released a single bomb, a weapon unlike any ever used before. It was nicknamed Little Boy, and it weighed over 9,000 pounds. It was made of uranium-235 and had never been tested. But its purpose was simple: end the war in a single flash. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating 1,900 feet above the city. In that instant, the world changed. A sudden, blinding white flash lit up the morning sky. The core of the explosion reached temperatures of over 1,000,000 degrees Celsius, hotter than the surface of the sun. A fireball expanded outward at the speed of sound. Below, in a radius of nearly 1 mile, every structure, homes, hospitals, temples, vaporized. People near the hypocenter were instantly incinerated, some reduced to shadows etched into walls, others completely erased. Thousands more were crushed beneath falling buildings or consumed by the inferno that followed. A shockwave rippled out, smashing windows 10 miles away. Then came a pillar of flame, and then the iconic mushroom cloud, rising over 60,000 feet into the atmosphere. Within moments, 70,000 people were dead. Within hours, the toll began to climb. The city was plunged into chaos. Survivors wandered through the ruins in stunned silence. Clothes burned from their bodies, skin peeling from their limbs, eyes blinded by the flash. They begged for water, many unaware that they had already been fatally poisoned by radiation. The wounded filled parks, riverbanks, and open streets, moaning softly. Medical services were non-existent, most of the doctors, nurses, and hospitals had been annihilated. And then, the black rain fell, oily, radioactive soot carried high into the sky by the explosion and condensed by the heat. It poured over the rubble, over the dead, and over the living who would soon join them. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to 140,000, as radiation sickness claimed thousands more. Children developed leukemia, women miscarried, and survivors, the hibakusha, bore the scars, both physical and psychological, for the rest of their lives. But Hiroshima was only the first. 3 days later, the US dropped a second bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki, killing another 70,000 people. 6 days after that, Emperor Hirohito broke centuries of silence, speaking on the radio to announce Japan's surrender. The war was over. But the debate had just begun. The atomic bombings ended World War II, but at what cost? Was it a necessary evil to avoid a bloody invasion of Japan, which might have claimed millions of lives? Or was it a calculated demonstration of power, to both Japan and the Soviet Union, unleashed on cities already close to defeat? Even among Allied leaders, the moral implications were heavy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later expressed deep regret, believing Japan was already on the brink of surrender. Scientists who built the bomb at Los Alamos, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, watched their creation with awe and dread. When Oppenheimer saw the first test detonation in New Mexico, he had whispered words from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Hiroshima was not just a military act. It was a beginning. The start of the atomic age, where humanity held the power to annihilate itself in minutes. In the decades that followed, the memory of that morning became a beacon for peace, a warning against the abyss. Today, the city of Hiroshima is a symbol of resilience. The Peace Memorial Park, built at Ground Zero, is watched over by the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome, the only structure left standing near the epicenter. It remains untouched, a monument to destruction and hope. Every August, paper lanterns float down the Motoyasu River, and thousands gather to remember the day the sky burned. Because Hiroshima is more than a city, it is a reminder. A reminder that in war, the line between victory and tragedy is written in fire. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff, the deadliest maritime disaster in history. As World War II neared its chaotic end in early 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing under the weight of Allied forces pressing in from both west and east. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army had launched Operation Vistula Oder, slicing through German-held Poland with astonishing speed. Civilians and military personnel alike fled in terror, desperate to escape the oncoming Soviet advance. Among them were thousands of Germans attempting to evacuate from East Prussia by sea, a massive operation codenamed Operation Hannibal, one of the largest evacuations by sea in history. Into this exodus stepped a ship with a tragic destiny, the Wilhelm Gustloff. Once a symbol of Nazi propaganda and the Strength Through Joy tourism program, the Wilhelm Gustloff had been a luxury liner before the war, named after a murdered Nazi functionary. By 1945, it had been repurposed into a transport vessel. On January 30, 1945, the ship departed from the port of Godenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, crammed far beyond capacity. Officially, the ship was meant to carry around 1,500 people. But as chaos unfolded, refugees swarmed aboard. By the time it left port, the Wilhelm Gustloff held over 10,000 people, including 5,000 children, wounded soldiers, nurses, and civilians. It was an Arctic night. Snow lashed the decks. The Baltic Sea was black and turbulent. German Naval Command assigned only one military escort, and the ship's anti-submarine defenses were either down or ignored in the confusion. The Gustloff sailed without proper zigzag evasive maneuvers, an open target. In the depths below the icy waves lurked Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko, a daring and disgraced officer desperate to redeem himself. At 9:16 p.m., Marinesco gave the order. 3 torpedoes struck the Wilhelm Gustloff in quick succession. The first slammed into the bow, killing hundreds of crew and female naval auxiliaries. The second tore into the midsection, flooding compartments and jamming doors. The third hit the engine room, knocking out power. Panic erupted. Lights failed. Cold water surged in. There were not nearly enough lifeboats or life jackets for the thousands aboard. In the chaos, passengers slipped and froze on the icy decks. Mothers clutched infants. Soldiers screamed for help. Some boats capsized immediately. Others never made it into the water. Hundreds leapt into the frigid sea, only to be pulled under by the vacuum of the sinking hull or to freeze to death in minutes. In just 45 minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff slipped beneath the waves. The death toll was staggering. Of the estimated 10,000 plus people aboard, only around 1,200 survived. More than 9,000 perished, including nearly 5,000 children, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in history, far surpassing the Titanic. And yet, few in the world heard about it. Why? Because by 1945, the world had grown numb to staggering loss. Nazi atrocities dominated headlines. The sinking was viewed by many as karmic retribution, not tragedy. And the Soviet Union had no interest in publicizing it. But for those who survived, mothers who lost children, sailors who swam through bodies, officers who floated for hours in silence, the memory never faded. Today, the Wilhelm Gustloff lies at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, a sunken mass grave shrouded in cold silence. It serves as a haunting reminder. In war, even civilians fleeing catastrophe can become casualties of history's forgotten corners. The Fugo attack, Japan's silent bombardment of America. In the winter of 1944, as Japan faced mounting pressure from Allied forces across the Pacific, a bizarre and audacious plan took shape deep within its military think tanks. The Empire of Japan, now on the defensive, sought ways to strike fear directly into the heart of the American mainland, a land largely untouched by the war that raged oceans away. But how could Japan attack the U.S. homeland across the vast, impassable Pacific Ocean? The answer came from the jet stream, a high-altitude river of air that races eastward from Asia to North America at speeds up to 200 miles per hour. Japanese scientists had studied this phenomenon extensively. Now, they would use it. Thus was born Fugo, the balloon bomb project. These were not your typical balloons. Each Fugo unit was a hydrogen-filled balloon, roughly 33 feet in diameter, crafted from lightweight paper made of mulberry trees, and meticulously glued together by thousands of schoolgirls and factory workers. Beneath each floated a payload, incendiary bombs and high-explosive charges designed to start wildfires, cause panic, and divert American resources away from the Pacific theater. From late 1944 to early 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 of these balloons, releasing them into the stratosphere where the jet stream would carry them silently across the Pacific to North America in just 3 days. And they worked. Beginning in November 1944, balloon bombs began landing across the U.S. and Canada, from Alaska to Arizona, from California to Michigan. Some exploded in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Others were found in rural fields, tangled in trees, or crashed in snowdrifts. At least 300 were confirmed to have landed in the U.S., though it's believed many more went undiscovered. But the Fugo campaign faced a problem: its effects were minimal. Despite Japanese hopes that the bombs would spark massive forest fires, most landed in wet, snowy areas. The U.S. government, meanwhile, imposed a strict news blackout, fearing that publicity would encourage Japan to escalate the campaign. Newspapers were forbidden from reporting the balloons, and citizens were told to keep silent if they found one. The campaign might have faded into obscurity, except for one tragic incident. On May 5, 1945, near Bly, Oregon, Reverend Archie Mitchell and his pregnant wife Elsie were leading 5 Sunday school children on a picnic. While Archie parked the car, Elsie and the children wandered into the woods. One of the children spotted something strange on the ground. An odd balloon apparatus with a tangle of metal and cloth. They approached it. Moments later, a sudden explosion ripped through the forest. All 6 were killed instantly, Elsie Mitchell and 5 children, aged 11 to 14. They became the only known U.S. civilians killed on American soil by enemy action during World War II. The news blackout was immediately lifted to warn the public of the danger. Yet, the incident remained largely forgotten in the wake of the war's final chapters. Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, and ultimately Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the end, the Fugo campaign was deemed a military failure, but it was nonetheless remarkable, a wartime innovation that used atmospheric science to carry weapons across continents without planes, ships, or soldiers. It was the first intercontinental weapon ever deployed. Even more astonishing, unexploded balloon bombs are still being discovered today, buried deep in forests or stuck in mountaintops, remnants of a forgotten Japanese assault that flew silently through the sky. In Bly, Oregon, a modest stone memorial now stands among the trees. It reads, "The only place on the American continent where death resulted from enemy action during World War II." The Battle of Castle Itter, when Americans and Germans fought together. In the waning days of the Second World War, when most of Europe was in ruins and Nazi Germany was gasping its last breath, an unlikely battle erupted high in the Austrian Alps. It would become one of the most surreal events in the entire war, a moment when former enemies laid down their arms and fought side by side against a common foe. This is the story of the Battle of Castle Itter, fought on May 5, 1945, just 3 days before Germany officially surrendered. Castle Itter, nestled in the Tyrolean Alps of Austria, was no ordinary fortress. During the war, it had been converted by the SS into a special prison for high-value French prisoners. Among its inmates were former prime ministers, generals, aristocrats, and even Charles de Gaulle's sister. It was a who's who of the French elite, many of them political rivals, some bitter enemies, and all detained under tight SS supervision. But as the Third Reich crumbled and American forces pushed deep into Austria, the SS began to retreat, chaotically, but not without violence. The prisoners, though trapped, sensed change in the air. Yet they also feared a massacre. The SS, known for executing prisoners in the final days, could wipe them out before liberation arrived. And so, they reached out, desperately, for help. By a twist of fate, a German Wehrmacht officer, Major Joseph Sepp Gangl, came to their aid. Disillusioned with the Nazis and sympathetic to the prisoners' plight, Gangl had begun cooperating with the local Austrian resistance. He received word of the danger and made an extraordinary decision: he would defend the French VIPs, even if it meant turning his guns on his fellow Germans. Gangl contacted a nearby American tank unit led by Captain John Jack Lee Jr., a bold and brash artillery officer in the 23rd Tank Battalion. When Lee heard that French dignitaries were being held hostage by the SS in a mountaintop fortress, he didn't wait for orders. He assembled a rescue team, a few Sherman tanks, a handful of infantrymen, and, astonishingly, Major Gangl and 10 of his German soldiers, now fighting with the Americans. Together, this ragtag group made their way to Castle Itter. What followed was the only known battle in World War II where American and German soldiers fought side by side against the Waffen-SS. As the sun rose on May 5, a force of about 100 SS troops surrounded the castle, determined to kill everyone inside. Inside the stone walls, Lee, Gangl, and their odd coalition, including the elite French prisoners, who took up arms themselves, prepared for a desperate defense. Bullets flew. The Sherman tank, parked at the gate, was disabled early in the fighting. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, and pinned down. But they held. Major Gengel was killed by sniper fire while pulling a French dignitary to safety, a heroic end for a man who had chosen honor over loyalty to a dying regime. Just as the situation grew dire, reinforcements from the American 142nd Infantry Regiment arrived, routing the SS attackers. The castle was saved. The prisoners survived. And history had been made. The Battle of Castle Itter remains one of the strangest engagements of the entire war. A moment where former enemies became allies, where aristocrats and generals fought shoulder to shoulder, and where war's rigid lines briefly blurred into something deeply human. To this day, the castle still stands, high in the Austrian Alps, a silent sentinel that once witnessed one of World War II's most improbable and heroic moments.